Hi, Yang. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you
Um,
for having me.
so, for those of you who may be tuning into this, let's just hear more about Young and his current film that we're going to be discussing. This is not a movie, but maybe just a quick introduction, a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Can you hear me all right? I'm just using the built-in headphone right now. My name is Chang. I'm a filmmaker based in Toronto. I've made three previous feature-length documentaries, and now I've just released my latest called This Is Not a Movie. And now it's been going through a virtual release, but we are releasing it throughout Canada and likely in the US soon. Um, and I, I, yeah, I've been doing this since 1999 in the business of filmmaking, and hopefully the next few projects will kind of be between documentary feature projects, a short, and a fiction film.
Nice. So you're fairly
Is that
busy.
good enough?
Yeah. Oh, of course, it's great. I know of your work from your second feature doc, I think, which is Heavyweight, China Heavyweight.
Hmm.
So I've been
Yes, China
following
Heavyweight. Yeah,
I've been
yeah.
following your trajectory, and I'm always very interested in your work because it introduces me to themes and people that maybe I hadn't considered in the past, but it's also done in a very humane way and compassionate way. And so I think that's also why, I wanted to discuss your latest documentary. This is not a movie, which is, it kind of introduces us to a very provocative and interesting figure in journalism, Robert Fisk. But it's not just about him. Can
Hmm.
you talk a little bit about the concept of that documentary?
Yeah, I mean, I think that from the get-go, it was very important to try not to make a straight-up biography or hagiography about someone like Robert Fisk. And for those who don't know, he's, sort of a legendary journalist, a dinosaur of the old style of reporting, boots on the ground. He's based in the Middle East and he reports from Beirut. He covers the Middle East region for the independent newspaper. And he's like, you know, he's a guy who's gotten a lot of dirt and a lot of, controversy because he sort of says what he believes. And I entered the filmmaking process realizing that his controversy surrounds him, and it's very much available. If you Google search Robert Fisk, you'll find a lot of stuff around him. And so my mission was to sort of like keep an eye out for the controversy, and to make sure to be kind of distance and get a sense of that part of him. um, but I learned a lot about his character, and I came out of the process. I mean, you will anyway if you make a film about somebody and you want to get to know them. You're gonna, and I spend a couple of years with the person. You're gonna get to know them through and through, and that's what happened to me. And so what was important for making the film was to make sure that it allowed that it was more a treatise or an essay on journalism rather than about a person, but but it uses the person to open the perspective on ideas about journalism. And we use Robert Fisk's ideas to present them to the audience to consider, to question. And I hope that is something that carries over for the audience after they watch the movie, that they take this to the dinner table, they have debates around it, because the film is really about the subjectivity of truth, and it's about questioning your beliefs in journalism. And especially in this day and age where um, the way we consume media is completely being rewritten. And so so for me, the film is much more um, about uh, about about kind of um, uh, taking how you sit with this idea of media literacy,
Mhm.
that being how we engage with information, and interpret the news, and kind of shake it up a little bit, because I think that is necessary more than ever. It came out of the elections in the U.S. with Donald Trump, and now it's here again with. I mean, Donald Trump has only made this more difficult for us all, obviously, because um, everything he says is a truth, which is not. We obviously know is not.
Right.
And it's constantly evolving his lies. And so I think we need to find ways to make sure we know what the truth is, and even more now that we're in this pandemic, and there is an onslaught of 24/7 headlines, that is constantly changing in terms of how we understand the virus. And I think we need to do our due diligence as consumers of information, to understand where we go and how we understand and interpret the news so that it becomes valuable and useful.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting you mentioned that, because I originally saw this film at TIFF last year in September, and
Yeah.
it was very relevant to me because I'm sort of this alternative media person as well.
Yeah.
I exist online, um, and I'm not part of the written word in terms of newspapers.
Right.
But now that I've seen the film yet another time during this pandemic, it actually becomes even more poignant with a lot of the messages that we hear through Fisk's words and through a lot of the visuals that you present. So, you know, I'm very keenly aware of this 24/7 news cycle, and I actually try to avoid it, to be
Yeah.
honest with you, because it is a delicate balance in terms of what really is the truth versus
Hmm.
what is just sensationalism.
Exactly.
And
And
I think
I
that's,
certainly.
yeah, and I think that's sort of one of the core values that Robert Fisk sort of embodies in sort of the things that he writes about, the way he writes about them as well.
Yeah.
So, what I find interesting, and I guess I think it might have been challenging, is how do you summarize his actual 40 years of work
Hmm.
with all of this footage that you had as well? Because from what I can tell is you were on the ground with him as well in current
Hmm.
times. Um,
Exactly.
what was that experience like in terms of, I want to be able to understand him and present him in a way that is meaningful?
Yeah, so I think that was the great challenge, and I'm lucky that I had some great producers who encouraged me to not go into the film with a preconceived sense of where it should go, which you know, which is one of the edicts of documentary filmmaking, is sort of be open to the process and move where it moves you. But also that usually in documentary filmmaking, like with my previous film that you've seen, China Heavyweight, there was this sense of like, okay, these are my characters. I know how to cover the story and follow this narrative, because documentary is narrative filmmaking. It is about storytelling. So I didn't have that with this story because it was so vast and it covered a 40-year expanse of time, and you can't cover it all in one movie. So I think for me it was identifying the theme, and the theme was about was more geared towards an assessment of modern journalism through the eyes of Robert Fisk, and using his career as reference points to dig into how we engage with media and interpret media. And so that was the guideline.
Mhm.
Uh, and essentially what happened was we kind of just went into it without a structure, and so then the structure evolved very organically in the post-production process. In the editing process, we spent a year editing the movie, and it required the year. We could have used more time as well, but it was really about taking the material we had, a very exhaustive interview with Robert Fisk, verite observational footage with Robert in Syria, in Bosnia, Beirut, et cetera, different places we went with him,
Right.
which was the present day. And then finding the balance with the archive that we had access to. We knew we had a couple very strong pieces of Robert's life documented in film. An early documentary that was made by the BBC about Robert's time in Northern Ireland when he looked like a crazy Woody Allen type character.
Yes.
And then we had, a piece from a film, a 3-part series that was shot on film in the early 90s, um, that kind of documented Robert in that in the height of his sort of his career, and so we knew that that material would be valuable to go back to, because the idea also was to build this sense that the cyclical nature of history was very important to Robert Fisk, because he's basically also what I would call a historian journalist, where that he knows so much about history and that informs his writing. And so that was a very important thing to get across. Even now in the pandemic, he knows. He's told me that pandemics have happened before in the past. We've all been through them. We haven't been through them, but society has been through pandemics before, and at the end of the day, you always come out of it. And that's a good thing to remember, I think. And from the Spanish influenza to today, I think there's and many of the same methods adopted back then and lockdowns, et cetera, is what we're adopting today. I mean, so I think so. The film essentially, it was important that we were balancing this past and present idea, and that was the basic structure of the film. And how we informed the sequences would be with what material we had in the interviews and what material we had, the present day material we had with him in the field, and how that connected then to the past. And those past stories that we follow in the movie are always sort of thematically based, so that they should be additive to the next present day story. It was a tricky balance, and it took a year to maneuver and figure out.
I figured so, because I mean the film is not a long film. Like we're not talking about a 2-hour documentary. So I can only imagine how much material there was, and the meticulousness of editing by Michael Munn, I think, right?
Michael Munn, and Mike is like, I just have to plug Mike. I mean, he's a genius editor, and we're so lucky that he's sort of like Canadian. He's like a gem, and and he's an editor. He cut some great films. For example, all the way back in the beginning of his career, he cut Bruce McDonald's Roadkill, and then he went on to do Peter Mettler's Picture of Light, and then more recently Sarah Polley's Stories We Tell. And so I grabbed him for my film because of what he did with Stories We Tell, and this ability to go from past to present and create, and just be able to work with archives so meticulously.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent flow in the film, because with documentaries, you need to have something that pulls you in as an audience, right? Like you want something that grabs you and just kind of, you just go along for the ride. And I think he did an excellent job with the editing in this film, particularly.
Great. And I think, one of the things we wanted to do was get out the gate pretty quick in the movie. And I think what we did with that opening sequence, it really establishes the rhythm of the film. How we open in the past and we jump immediately, this magic cut into the present seamlessly. And I think that for me is a very important moment to establish, okay, this is the ride you're going to be on, and it's going to take you all over the place.
Yeah. The other thing I'm curious about, and I wanted your thoughts on, is, balancing the fact that, Robert Fisk has a lot to share. He talks a lot. There's a lot of information. Balancing, sort of the way that he narrates parts of the film in a way, with those moments in the film where there's not a lot of talking, which I really enjoyed. Like the moments where we see him at home working at the computer, or writing, and I notice he uses shorthand. Like there's a lot of things to be noticed in silence. So how did you try to balance those out?
I mean, that was crucial, and one thing we were worried about was that the film would be too relentless with his voice. And I'll just clarify, like the narration moments I would put in quotes, because actually anything that is narration is often him reading from the articles that he wrote, which are all available online through his website, through the independent newspaper which he writes for. You can find all his columns and stories that he wrote that we cover in the film, and you can dive into those in more detail. But online on the website. So he reads from his articles, and then the other voiceover you hear from him they were not, he didn't write them, and in fact it's just through interviews that we collected these voices, this voiceover. And so it was one of the big challenges was to find where to build in the breaths and the moments of silence so that we can consider and question the material we're presented with, the ideas he presents us with. And so that was very strategically done. And I'm glad that you've sort of noted that, because those places were intentionally built so that you can have a moment to breathe, to take it in, prepare for the next roller coaster ride in the film. And yeah, so there's these organically built-in breaths, and I think I think, like you said, I think they allow you to give you a little breathing room to to consider, to put that back in the file it in, put it in your filing cabinet for the next scene, and then take it all home later to talk about.
Yeah, now that you mentioned the files, that particular scene where you show the archives that he has just really hit home to me, because I'm also that person who thinks, oh, I should keep all my notebooks,
Right.
You want to have a source, and not, like he says, not everything is on the internet, right?
Exactly.
At least for his own research, not everything's on the internet. So I do appreciate those moments, and I also appreciate how they're built sometimes around very key sayings, or he does make some profound statements about war and humanity, and those moments sort of allows to, like you said, let it sink in. And I'm still thinking about them now. This is the reason why I asked about them, because I found them very moving on repeat watching, like my repeat viewing of the film.
No, I think there's something that touches me too, and because he taps into his approach to journalism, and it's clearly this whole idea, and I want to talk about this because it's his whole idea of journalism is to report on the side of those who suffer, to question authority, especially when it comes to governments who put us in the face of war. These are crucial, and I think for a journalist to use that as his for lack of a better word, his mantra. That's what essentially I learned from making the film, is that he gets into trouble because he's built this mantra for himself, and it puts him into these controversial places because he's always going back to that idea: question authority, report on those who suffer. And so I came out of it like, oh, that's why you're who you are. You're not anti-Semitic. You're not pro-Assad. You are who you are because that's your integrity guides you to those places.
Right.
And he's unwavering in that integrity. It grounds him, and he doesn't care to get into the debate about it because he knows that's not him. He knows that what he's doing is essentially what every journalist should do, and what I bring into the end of the film, which is the notion of the least a journalist can do is keep a record of the event, so that nobody can question whether or not it happened or not. And I would add to that nobody can put the spin of one perspective on it, that there's going to be always two quote unquote objective perspectives on the story. And that hopefully when we engage with media and we understand that media literacy involves us to look at both sides, both perspectives, then that is how, that's how we suss out the truth. And the truth is very subjective at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I think a lot of us sometimes become complacent and we don't really search for information as readily as we might have in the past for those of us who grew up with no internet access for a little while. You remember having to go to different sources to find information. So we know what that's like, but now I think it's just easier to pick up a phone and look something up and think, okay, this is what I found on one source. It should be correct. And
exactly, and it should never be the first, right? The way we engage with media now, it shouldn't be what we pull up on the first page of a Google search. Right. You got to go a little bit deeper than that. Go into the fifth page, and that kind of way of thinking.
Yeah, but I also think it ties really neatly with documentary filmmaking too, because, because I am a documentary fan, I think I gravitate to documentary films because I do see that there's research involved in the process of filmmaking. And sure, there will be certain films that are documentaries that have a certain point of view, but they're still trying to sort of get us to think from different perspectives, which is what I
Exactly.
appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the great things about, one of the clarifications about documentary filmmaking is that it is very subjective. And if you were to break it down, even where you point the camera becomes a subjective decision. Where you consider an edit becomes a subjective decision. We are taking, as filmmakers, we are taking a point of view and we're trying to push it through, you know. And sometimes we try to do it in a way that makes sure that we try to cover both sides of the argument. Or, you know, we come in with the argument and we want to push that argument through so that at least what we do in long form documentary filmmaking is to really, it's like, in my opinion, it's like reading a long book about, you know, like a Robert Fisk book, you know, like it's sort of taking that and going into long form reading and going and reading, and rather than reading the headlines in the, in the newspaper, you then open up, for example, the New Yorker, and you go, or the Atlantic Monthly, and you go deeper into a story or an issue that is a current affair issue, you know, whether it be the pandemic or something else. Right. So yeah, I feel like that is, I think as documentary filmmakers, we're not supposed to be objective storytellers, and that we do come in with a thesis, and you do try to present arguments and look at opposing points of view, but at the end of the day, we are creating a story, and we're trying to bring across something more emotional rather than I think statistical or or reportage. You know, it's not, what we're doing is not what you get when you read a newspaper article. I think what we're trying to do is to bring a little more, as you said earlier, I think for me, my goal is to bring a little more humanity into the conversation, and right. And to really, because we're in a privileged position as filmmakers to have access to other worlds, that we can bring you into that world and hopefully give it shape and context and subtext.
Right. So, you know, that brings me to the journey of the film. You know, you premiered at TIFF, you've presented it at other festivals, so it's had a life of its own prior to this pandemic and lockdown.
Yeah.
So how have you noticed, what was that journey like, being able to travel with it, with Fisk, and now presenting it online or virtually?
Yeah, it's been odd. I was very geared up for this sort of international release, although I am more tethered now to my home because I have a young child. It changes how I used to engage with traveling, which in a way is, to me, it's lovely to be at home because I just get more opportunity to be with my family. Yeah. But it has changed the engagement. I appreciate when I'm able to go to a festival and then have a live audience give me feedback, and if experience, for me, cinema on the big screen is the best way to engage with a movie, and especially a documentary, when you can share it with an audience in a big dark room. It changes how you interact with something and makes it deeper and more emotional. Right. So that to me is a little saddening that we are reduced to those limitations now. But then again, I'm grateful that there's ways that we have technology that we can push something out. And so we are doing these virtual screenings now. Next week, I'm doing a live Q&A with Thessaloniki Film Festival in Greece. And then, with the virtual screenings, earlier today, I did a pre-recorded Q&A for St. Catharines, Ontario Film House. And then I'm doing one next week for the Winnipeg Film Group. So, and Montreal, I'm going to do one for Cinema Moderne. So, and I did one for Hot Docs. So, I think that has been really useful, that we can still share the movie this way. And that shows the resilience of humanity as well, I guess, that we find ways to pick up and keep going.
And that people also want various content, It's not always going to be the dramatized series or films that, we want a bit of diversity and variety
And I think documentaries, right? I think documentaries never been so popular than it is now, and I think people want to engage. I think as a result of the previous U.S. elections in 2016, that we are now. I think there was a burst of interest in documentary, long form filmmaking, or at least just that kind of that investigative journalism, that or documentary filmmaking that deepens the argument or the conversation. And so I think and because we have these platforms like Netflix who are releasing these documentary series, I think things are really ramping up in terms of how people want, current affair stories, but through the eyes of filmmakers who can deepen the conversation and the theme, and you're seeing that, I think. And it's not reality TV. We're talking about it's documentary filmmaking, so it's got a more cinematic kind of feel to it,
Right.
and it's always character driven, and it's I think that's really important.
I think so too. So before we wrap up, I wanted to talk about what you're working on, because you quickly mentioned that you've been busy and you have other projects coming up.
Yeah, I do.
What should we look forward to?
So coming up this summer, I've been just working on actually a pandemic film about frontline workers in the U.S. And I'm actually co-directing that with my partner here. And so out of the pandemic, we've collaborated on a few projects. Another one is a short film that we made that was through Thessaloniki Film Festival. They commissioned it, and it's available online. And it's called We Are in This Apart. And it's a short film that I made on my smartphone with my partner. And it was a lot of fun to make, and it's a quarantine film. So I've got that's out now, and then I've got the pandemic film coming out soon. And then I've got this big project that was just greenlit by Telefilm, and it's going to be a feature documentary about hockey in China, and it's a look at the challenges and of the rise of a national hockey team for the 2022 Olympics, where China is actually competing in Group A with Canada, Russia, like the top hockey teams.
Right.
And will they actually be vying for a medal or not? Are they actually in a place to do that? We will see. But I know that we have Canadian characters involved with the Chinese national hockey team. We have crazy access into the story, and we have NHL hockey stars, and we have Chinese Canadians who are unbelievable hockey players in a position to play on the national Chinese hockey team, but they have to give up their Canada citizenship. Right. So it'll be an interesting story, and I think it sort of brings us up to date with the way the world works between countries right now, and it'll be a microcosm, I think, about that.
Interesting. So we'll look up for that in the near future, I hope.
Great. Yeah, hopefully soon.
Yes, thanks.
Next couple of years.
That's great. Anything else you want to share in terms of what's going on at your end?
I'm still working on my fiction film, so I'm hoping to make that soon too. It's called Eggplant. Yes. I think what's important is hopefully people will reach out and look for the film in Canada. This is not a movie for its virtual screenings across the country. Portion of the sales of the tickets purchases goes towards helping out independent cinemas. So there's a website through Blue Ice Docs that you can see the list of cinemas across the country, and then by clicking on those, you can support the cinema and also watch the film. And that's mostly what I want to mention. And I'm reachable always through my website or through Twitter.
And your website is?
Youngfilms.com. Okay. YUNGFILMS.com. And then same thing, Young Films on Twitter.
Great. Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you very much.